So we're going to talk about legal and ethical. These are two really interesting topics to talk about. They're two of my favorite ones to talk about, but it's always those fine lines and you kind of start chasing rabbit holes, but um, just different interesting cases and legal aspects of being a nurse. So as far as legal, with legal, we have different sources of law at the federal level. And when we talk about HIPAA is actually Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. We've already started talking about HIPAA throughout the semester and patient confidentiality and making sure that we don't spread any patient information. We don't carry information off the units that we're on for clinical, and we're not talking about things we see in clinical. That's all based around HIPAA. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. PSDA is the Patient Self-Determination Act. And then MHPA is your Mental Health Parity Act. And we're going to talk about these a little bit more. So laws are established to help protect society. Law is a binding practice. It's a rule, code of conduct that helps to guide community or society by controlling authority. Nursing practice is guided by legal principles. We're outlined with expectations whenever we are providing care. We have a legal framework that looks at laws, regulations, standards of practice that we have to follow. One of the common themes that we see is that nurses work under this framework, and nurses are legally responsible for your own actions. Your legal responsibility can't be delegated. We all have that legal responsibility to make sure that we are working under the scope of nursing practice and following in our realm of how we should practice. The purpose of the laws to help protect clients and society, protect our patients. It helps to define the scope of nursing practice and then also identify a minimum level of care that should be provided to our patients. As far as sources of our law, our laws come from U.S. Constitution. We have federal and state legislatures. We have administrative agencies, and we also have courts. So nurse licensure, whenever you go through nursing school and you get out of school and you pass the NCLEX, that's what we're aiming for is everybody to graduate, pass your NCLEX, and then you would become licensed as a registered nurse. Nurse licensure is different by state. So you're licensed in each state. If you take your NCLEX in Tennessee, then you become licensed in the state of Tennessee by the Tennessee State Board of Nursing. All the blue states that you see on the map are all compact states, and they have a compact agreement. So one license, you can practice in all of these blue states. They have an agreement. There's roughly 35 different states, and there may be a little bit of paperwork that you need to do, but as a rule, you kind of have an agreement that you are able to practice within those states. This helps tremendously in the aspect of travel nursing, telehealth, a lot of remote jobs where people are working from home for certain healthcare companies. They may be working from their home at their house, but their company may be based out of another state. Different branches of government that help, in the law process, legal aspect of healthcare. You have the executive branch. This is your president, helps to execute and enforce your laws. We have legislative, that's your Congress, which is your House of Representatives, and your Senate. They help to make the laws. And then we have the judicial, which is your courts. They help to interpret the laws and then decide rulings on cases. So if you look at the three different branches in your picture down here, and how they're divided up. Your federal laws that help to guide nursing practice that we really look at, the Bill of Rights. Your Bill of Rights was actually the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and we just classify them as the Bill of Rights. There clearly identifies many limits and the roles in government with certain individuals. Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. You're going to hear this one called EMTALA. This one talks about medical screening and stabilize patients. It helps prevent what we call patient dumping. This actually is where, and you hear a lot about it in the emergency department a lot, but it helps healthcare facilities provide emergency medical treatment to patients who are seeking healthcare in the emergency department. When they do this, regardless of their ability to pay, whether or not they have insurance, their legal status, whether they are, an immigrant and they are here illegally, their citizenship status, they don't look at any of that. We have to provide them with emergency medical treatment, regardless of any of these other aspects. It kept private hospitals from dumping patients because they couldn't pay. And make sure that we have public access to emergency services no matter what. They always have that access. And then our ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, this one is protection against discrimination of those with disabilities. Employers must provide accommodations for those with disabilities. This is big in healthcare as far as, and different employers making sure we have accommodations for those with the disabilities. Your Patient Self-Determination Act of 1991, this talks about two legal written directives. So living will and power of attorney. This is something that you will deal with and hear about every day of your nursing career for the rest of your lives. Your living will is a document that is set in place that the patient identifies their wishes in regards to what they want done whenever they can no longer make decisions. Do they want CPR? Do they want life-saving measures? Do they want a feeding tube, or do they want artificial nutrition? It gives them those options to choose that, so they have a legal document in place whenever they're no longer able to make their decisions. The power of attorney, this allows them to designate a person that can be in charge to make their healthcare decisions in the event they can no longer make their decisions. And then the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or your HIPAA. That's your confidentiality of patient records. The patient can see those and make corrections if needed, but they are only available to the patient under request. Family members can't view patient records unless they go through the process of going through medical records and viewing those patient records. Otherwise, that's a HIPAA violation. So question, on admission to UT Medical Center, patient indicates that he would like information about making a living will. The nurse informs the patient that the hospital does not have a process in place to facilitate this. UT Medical Center Knoxville is not in compliance with which of the following? Correct answer should be D. That's the Patient Self-Determination Act. Your Patient Self-Determination Act requires healthcare agencies to provide information to patients if they wish. Living will is a type of advance directive. So your living will and your power of attorney, they kind of go hand in hand, and we classify those as advance directives, giving the healthcare provider some legal documentation of what the patient wants. Whenever they come into the hospital, typically we ask them, do they have a living will, or do they have a power of attorney, or would they like help getting those set up? State laws that help with guiding practice. We have mandatory reporting laws. There are certain things that we encounter as healthcare workers that are mandatory to be reported. Laws in various states There are certain communicable diseases that are mandatory that they be reported. You also have a duty to be a mandatory reporter in the aspect of abuse. Could be by a family or healthcare worker. Physical abuse could be sexual abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, neglect could be neglect of children, older adults, mentally ill. We see a lot of times that it's not just children that get abused, it's also the elderly and the people who are no longer able to care for themselves. Another law that we have that kind of guides nursing practice, we have the Good Samaritan law, and this differs by state, but typically your Good Samaritan law, those are designed to protect you from liability if you are providing emergency care to someone who is injured. Typically, you think of this one where you're driving down the road and you see a car accident happen, and the nurse may stop to help. Your Good Samaritan laws help to protect them from liability in the event that something were to happen down the road and they get sued. And then your Nurse Practice Acts, these vary by state as well. And these talk about credentialing, licensing, and also the discipline of nursing. It is made to designed to protect patients or the society so that nurses know their legal scope and know how they are legally responsible to act, and their legal credentialing process, their licensing process. And it also helps to define and talk about your scope of practice. As far as standards of practice, we have a standard of care or standard of practice. You'll hear it both ways. We look at what's a reasonable and prudent nurse would do in the same or similar scenario. It outlines expectations of how care is provided. If one practices outside of this expectation, then lawsuits are more successful. If you are doing things that are classified outside the standard of care, then you're giving more ammo in a way in the event of a lawsuit. An important element of your malpractice lawsuits or disciplinary actions is, did the nurse practice under their standard of care, or did they practice outside of what is a normal expectation of how the care should be provided? This is derived from Nurse Practice Acts, professional organizations such as American Nurses Association, and also looked at from the Joint Commission. Other guidelines that help guide nursing practice, we have institutional policies and procedures in place. We have nursing codes of ethics, and we have patient care partnerships, and then we have the ANA Nurses Bill of Rights. So, a question. There are no legal consequences for nurses who do not follow the ANA or the American Nurses Association standards of professional performance, as these are not laws. True or false? Your correct answer would be B, and that would be false. Your ANA standards of care are one group of professional nursing standards held to define what a reasonable and prudent nurse would do in a practice environment. In the court of law, nurse could be found guilty of negligence for failing to do what a reasonable and prudent nurse would do. So criminal law, when we look at criminal law is your federal or state government prosecutes. It's an offense against society. These are the ones that we typically think of. Speeding tickets, minor crimes, DUIs. There's certain different levels. So these can all lead to either fines, they can lead to imprisonment, or it can also lead to death, depending on what your criminal law, what is committed. So your infraction, that would be more so like a speeding ticket. A misdemeanor, those involve less than a year in jail. Those are a minor crime. These can be assault, battery, could be petty theft. You can also lose your nursing license if you're convicted of a misdemeanor that involves crimes against persons that cause harm to others. So looking at, what kind of crime did you commit? This could also include DUI, can include other crimes as well, but think about your minor crimes. Felonies are, we say, more than a year in jail. A lot of times we think homicide, murder, assisted suicide, rape, sexual assault, stealing drugs, felony abuse, high dollar thefts. Those, when you are convicted of a felony, you lose a lot of your rights. You can lose the right to vote, hold a public office, serve on a jury, and you can also lose your professional license as well if you're convicted of a felony. So civil law, there's, criminal law, and then we also have the civil law. Civil law is going to allow for resolution of dispute between private parties. It may result in monetary compensation, and then we also have the plaintiff and defendant whenever we're talking about civil law. A tort, when we talk about what a tort is, it's going to be a civil wrong against another person. The law provides remedies that are monetary, in contrast with criminal law, which offenders face jail time. So in civil law, we have the plaintiff, which is the person being sued or bringing suit. Sorry, I said that wrong. And then your defendant, and then that's the person being sued. So those are the two people that you see in the aspect of civil law. Different types of civil law. We have contract law. This one is dealing with an agreement between individuals. Can be explicit or implicit. And then we have tort law. This one deals with wrongs done to one person by another person. It does not involve contracts. It's a civil wrong, and there are three types of different torts, but we're dealing with duties and rights among individuals. Can involve claims for damages as well. So some torts that you're going to deal with or see that may occur in nursing practice. Quasi-intentional torts. We have defamation. So defamation is false communication to a third person. Defamation of character. There's 4 things that have to be present for defamation of character to occur. Can be written or oral. So if it's slander, you're going to see oral defamatory statements. So think S for slander, S spoken, and then you also have libel. Libel is written defamatory statements. So it has to have 4 characteristics for this to be present. The statements or communication has to be false. It has to be made to another person or persons. Has to have caused the defamed person to experience shame or ridicule and have a negative impact on the person's reputation. And then also made as a statement of fact rather than an opinion. So intentional torts that we have are assault and battery. Assault is more so your threat. How I keep these straight in my mind is you think battery, think bat. Maybe they're hitting someone with a bat. The battery involves actual touching. It can be physical contact made with a patient without their consent. You have unauthorized touching of a person by another person, performing a procedure without consent by the patient. But assault is just your threat. Battery is the actual touching. Most of the time you do see those kind of go hand in hand and together, but think assault comes first typically and then battery. False imprisonment, an example of this one. This is restraining a person without proper legal authorization. Restraining a client against his or her will. Maybe they are wanting to leave the hospital and we're trying to restrain them against their will. if they are in their alert and oriented and we're trying to restrain them against their will. Fraud's failing to provide essential information for informed consent, false representation of significant facts, can be making false statements, falsifying documentation, and people actually do that. And then invasion of privacy, that's a breach of confidentiality. I would encourage you to go to this link and look at this about the Lamar Odom and the employees being fired at this hospital. It's just a good case to look at as far as dealing with the breach of confidentiality. So question. Trina, an RN on the nursing unit, states to the student nurse, I see you're working with Beth today. Make sure you watch your patient carefully because I think Beth is one of our worst nurses. The student knows that this statement could be considered. This one would be B, slander. So slander, it was spoken, it was an oral statement reflecting only her opinion that may cause harm to her colleague's reputation. Slander, words falsely spoken that damage the reputation of another. So think S, slander, S is spoken. Negligence. Negligence is whenever we have a failure to act as a reasonable, prudent person would. Failure to use reasonable care, we're not following standards of practice, and then harm occurs. We might not have an intent to harm, but the harm still occurs to our patients. This could be failing to document, failing to use equipment appropriately. It could also be nurse manager giving an inappropriate patient to an inexperienced nurse. It could be a brand new nurse, a new graduate nurse, and they give a very critical patient to the nurse. We also have malpractice. When I think malpractice, we're going to think bad. It's a professional form of negligence, and they're failing to act in a reasonable and prudent manner by a professional. For this one, you have to have 4 elements to collect damages. You have to have existence of a duty, so like nurse to patient relationship. Breach of the duty, we're failing the standards that we are supposed to abide by. Causation, we have an injury to the patient, and then damages, money as a remedy. Common malpractice claims that you're going to see: failure to assess and diagnose, failure to plan. That could be failure to plan your plan of care for your patient, failing to implement the plan of care, and then failure to evaluate. Observing for changes after treatments, interventions, that would all be failure to evaluate. And if you look at, we're looking at pieces of the nursing process there. How we can help to minimize malpractice risk and make sure that we are practicing appropriately. Always think in the back of your mind, go back to if it was not documented, it was not done. I know many of you all have heard me say this in clinical. If we didn't document it, then we didn't do it. So making sure you do proper documentation, it's complete, it's clear, it's correct, it's comprehensive and chronological. Making sure that we're observing standards of practice, using nursing process, following professional standards, we're avoiding medication and treatment errors. Think back to this is, we make you pass the medication math test before you go to give meds in clinical because we want you to avoid those medication errors. Report and document accurately, obtain informed consent, and attend to client safety. If we do all of these things, we can help to minimize risk of malpractice and minimize harm to our patients. Also, we can do this by maintaining client confidentiality, providing education, counseling to our patients, delegating correctly, assigning and supervising properly. A lot of your errors in practice are based on improper delegation. We haven't delegated appropriately to who we should be delegating, or we've delegated the wrong task. Accept appropriate assignments for what we have been assigned care. Participate in continuing education to always keep your knowledge up to date, making sure that we are looking at the most recent evidence-based practice. We're continuing our education to make sure that we are up to date with everything going on. Observing professional boundaries, observing mandatory reporting regulations, and then being aware of legal safeguards for nurses. So state boards, the purpose of state boards, those help to investigate and enforce disciplinary action against nursing licenses. Every state has a state board of nursing that they look at, what happens to the nursing license. Do they grant nursing their license to a particular person, or if that nurse focuses out of their or practices out of their standard of practice and out of their scope of practice, what happens at that point? What disciplinary action gets put in place? And we have courts. Your criminal courts, they help to bring the charges, which maybe be jail time. Civil torts are brought by a family or patient, and that's more talking about your money that can be paid to solve those. Employer, their responsibilities, they're helping to discipline, fire an employee, and train new employees so that we're avoiding these cases in the case of malpractice. Patient abandonment. This is something that you will also hear about as a legal aspect in the nursing world, healthcare world. For patient abandonment, two things must have happened. The nurse must have accepted the assignment, so they've established a nurse-patient relationship. They have taken report from the oncoming nurse, and they have established that relationship. At that point, then they sever the relationship without reasonable notice to another nurse who can continue care. So, for example, the nurse comes in, takes report from the previous nurse, and decides, I can't do this. This is too much. I can't take care of these patients. And doesn't notify anybody, doesn't pass on report and pass the patients on to another nurse, and leaves. They sever that relationship. That would be patient abandonment. Patients are getting cared for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there always has to be someone taking care of those patients, assigned to be taking care of those patients. Someone should be in charge to make sure that continuity of care is happening, so that you're giving report to another person before leaving. Other legal things that can happen in healthcare. Sentinel events. Joint Commission describes a sentinel event as a patient safety event that actually ends in death, could be permanent harm or severe temporary harm. Any of these listed in your picture are examples of sentinel events. Suicide while they're receiving care within 72 hours of discharge. The client elopes. A fire, assault, false imprisonment, client falls, pressure injuries. All of these can be examples of sentinel events to where Joint Commission can get notified and certain legal things have to occur. Emergency consent and treatment. If experts agree that immediate threat to life or health existed. This, if you think back to, if you watch Grey's Anatomy, there's a specific